Hi kids, I'm back with chapter 3, the Boxcar Children. So you will remember that there seems to be a bit of a mystery about the house and about the housekeeper, Mrs. McGregor. Chapter 3, the mystery. The children were lonesome after the wedding. They longed so much for Joe and Alice. But just then the mystery of the little house began. Supper was over, warm air was blowing through the open windows, and the birds were singing their evening songs. As Mr. Alden sat down in his easy chair, he said with a pleasant smile, "Isn't it time to think about summer plans?" Henry looked at his grandfather. "Grandfather," he said, "do you mind if I ask you something?" "No, of course not," said Mr. Alden. "Ask anything you like." "You may not think it's polite," said Henry. "But what is a grandfather for?" asked Mr. Alden, winking at Benny. "I know you're very polite to me always, Henry. Go ahead and don't be afraid." "Well," said Henry, "do you remember last fall I asked you why we never went into the little yellow house on Surprise Island? You looked very cross for a minute, and Jessie and I were sure we'd hurt your feelings." Jessie went on, "Don't you remember? You said, 'That's another story.'" "Oh, I remember all right," said Mr. Alden. "I never could forget that." He looked from one face to another. "If you 4 children will come over here and sit down on the floor, I will tell you all about it. I guess the time has come when you ought to know." Mr. Alden waited until they were ready to listen, and then he began. "You know, I told you my father built the barn on Surprise Island for his best racehorses, and that the man who took care of the horses built the little yellow house for himself. That man's name was Bill. He was about 30 years old then, and so was I. I loved Bill very much. He took fine care of the racehorses, and he lived in that little yellow house with his good wife." "Racehorses?" cried Benny. "Did they race?" "Yes, they raced while my father was living. My father was your great-grandfather, you know. Well, Bill loved the horses, and he was a good, kind man, but I must tell you, he was weak in spirit." "Not very strong, you mean?" "No, Benny," said Mr. Alden. "I don't mean that at all. He was a very physically strong man. He could lift a boat. I mean he had a weak will. Anybody could tell him what to do." Mr. Alden stopped. "Don't tell us if you don't want to," begged Jessie. "Yes, I want to tell you. I'm afraid Bill was a coward. He would do anything his brother Sam told him. His brother had some bad friends." The children were suddenly very quiet. They knew that this was a sad story for their grandfather to tell. "Let me go and get Watch, please. I'll be right back." Everyone had to smile as Benny disappeared into the kitchen. They knew that Benny always wanted the dog when things did not go just right. He came back at once with Watch running after him. "Lie down, old fellow," said Henry. Watch lay down beside Benny and put his head on his paws. Mr. Alden went on. "Well, one evening, Bill's wife, Margaret, noticed that Bill seemed to have something on his mind. He would not talk about it. After she'd gone to bed, she heard a queer grating noise in the front room where Bill was. She got up and went to see what he was doing. There he sat reading the paper. The noise had stopped. He asked her what she wanted, and she told him about the queer noise. He said it must have been the waves on the rocks. But it wasn't the waves, and Margaret knew it. She began to be very worried. She went back to bed and pretended to be asleep, and the noise began again." "Did she ever find out what it was?" "No, Benny, she never did. To this day, nobody knows what Bill was doing in that front room. This went on for 2 nights. The next night, Margaret smelled something queer. She thought it might be paint. But when she came out, Bill was not painting, he was reading. Then, one night, he went out to the barn to see the horses, and he never came back. Never? Said Violet. Nope. Margaret waited an hour, then she took a light and went out to look for him. He'd given the horses water, but he'd left the barn door open. The rowboat was gone. Then Margaret telephoned to me. I got up and dressed and found a policeman. Captain Daniel took us over to the boat and took us over to the island in another boat. But of course it was dark and we couldn't find a thing. No clues? That's right, Benny. No clues. Next day, the island was full of policemen. They looked under the barn, under the dock, all through the woods. They couldn't find Bill. They found Bill's rowboat a few days later. It was tied up at another dock about a mile away on the mainland. Did they radio the news and get the FBI? There weren't any radios back then, Benny. It was a long time ago. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. But at last they found him, right? No, they never found Bill. Mr. Alden stopped and then he went on again. Margaret thought the clues were the queer smell and the grating noise in the front room. So police went over the little yellow house. They thought they might find a letter. Margaret thought she had seen Bill reading one. There are the police looking through the whole house. They thought they might find a letter. Margaret thought she'd seen Bill reading one. You mean maybe a letter frightened Bill? Said Henry. Yes, that's right, but they never found one. They took up the rugs, they hunted through the desk, they even went down the chimney with a light. Did they lift the floorboards? Asked Henry. No, they didn't take them up, but they looked at every board in the house and there was dust between every 2 boards. Why didn't they put a notice in the newspaper? Asked Violet. Oh, they did. We had a notice in the newspaper every single day for 2 years. Nothing ever came of it. I'm sorry for Margaret, said Violet. She must be old now. Yes, my dear, said her grandfather with a smile. She seems old to you, I know. Seems old, said Violet. Do I know her? Yes, you all know her very well. She's Mrs. McGregor. Mrs. McGregor, shouted the children. They couldn't believe it, for Mrs. McGregor had taken care of them and listened to their troubles ever since they'd come to live with their grandfather. They could not think of her as young or as anyone involved in a mystery. At last, Henry said, I suppose she couldn't live alone on the island, and so great-grandfather gave her a home here, right? That's right, Henry. He asked her to come here to live with us as our housekeeper, and the next year, he died. She's lived here ever since. We never talk about Bill now, and nobody's ever been inside the yellow house since that time. Well, it's such a lovely little house, cried Jessie. It's too bad it's such a sad place and nobody can live there. Henry sat up and put his hand on his grandfather's knee. Grandfather, could we go into that little yellow house? I do wish you'd let us. Just let us look around. We might find something. Mr. Alden looked at Henry and smiled. You're a good boy, Henry. But you really do think you could find anything when the police couldn't? No, I suppose not, said Henry. But just the same, all the children kept looking at their grandfather. Suddenly, Grandfather leaned forward. Do you really want to go? Oh, yes, they all answered. Well, all right, you may. We may hunt around all you like and see what you can find. And then Benny said, I don't want to go. You don't want to go, said Henry. Why not? Well, I think it would be mean to go without Joe and Alice. They won't come home from their wedding trip for 2 weeks. Is that all? Asked Jessie. You scared me, Benny. I thought you really didn't want to go. We'd all like to wait, said Violet. It'll be much more fun if Joe and Alice can be with us. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we found something out, like a clue, said Henry. Yes, it would, said Mr. Alden, but I don't think you will. Don't talk about this to Mrs. McGregor just yet, will you? We won't, promised Henry. Look, Benny, you won't tell, will you? I never tell secrets, do I? I never told where Joe and Alice went on their wedding trip, did I? Do you know? Asked Henry in great surprise. Of course I do. You do? Said Mr. Alden. I don't know myself. Nobody told me. They told me I could tell you 2 days after the wedding. That's right now. Where did they go? Cried Jessie. They went to our barn on Surprise Island. That was another surprise because they're so close and everyone thinks they're far away. Just think of that. Our very own barn where we stayed last summer, said Jessie. That's right. He was so delighted. He surprised even his grandfather. Well, said Henry, now I can hardly wait for them to come home. I shan't sleep a wink tonight, said Jessie. I will be thinking of Joe and Alice and the little yellow house. They all expected to stay awake all night, but they were soon sleeping quietly, even watch. End of chapter 3.